You know that kind of person who loves to meddle in other people's lives, discussing house color palettes, and, apparently, counting cars in other people's garages. And that's exactly how this clowning started. One fine day, a letter arrived in my mailbox, and I already knew that something bad was coming, because these letters from the HOA never bring good news. I opened the envelope and found a notice. You are violating community guidelines by exceeding the limit of vehicles allowed per household. Your monthly fee will be increased by 50% until the issue is resolved. I stopped. I took a deep breath. Reread it to make sure I wasn't having a stroke. 50%? Because of CARS. Now, let me explain something. I did have a lot of cars, but it wasn't because I was a crazy hoarder. It's just that I like to collect and restore some old models. And detail. All the cars were parked perfectly on my property. None on the street, none blocking the way, none in anyone's way. But, apparently, the mere fact that I had more than what was allowed was already a capital offense for these people. Obviously, I wasn't going to take this clowning quietly. So I went to the HOA headquarters to have a little chat with this woman and understand where the hell she got this absurd rule from. I got there, and, as expected, she was already waiting for me with that superior look of someone who thinks she's about to teach a disobedient neighbor a lesson. "Oh, good of you to come," she said, with that tone of someone who already feels victorious. "I imagine you received the notice." "Yes, I did, and I think there's a mistake," I replied, feigning patience. She tilted her head, as if she were dealing with a stubborn child. "There is no mistake. The regulations are clear. Each home can have a maximum of 4 vehicles parked on the property. You have—" She paused dramatically, picked up the clipboard, and slid her finger across the notes. 9. I swear I felt my eye twitch slightly. "And where exactly in the regulations is that?" I asked, crossing my arms. She gave me a forced smile and started leafing through a ridiculous little book full of useless rules, until she stopped on a page and pointed to a paragraph. "Vehicles parked in residences must maintain the visual harmony of the environment and not cause visual pollution to the neighborhood." I blinked a few times. That doesn't say anything about a 4-car limit. "But it does say something about visual pollution," she retorted, thinking she was the smart one. "And 9 cars clearly cause aesthetic disorder." I took a deep breath. If I didn't have self-control, I think I would have laughed in her face. Because, ironically, her house was so tacky that all that was missing was a neon sign flashing, "Welcome to the hell of bad taste," on the door. But, well, I could just get rid of a few cars and get it over with, right? Wrong. Because what this woman didn't know was that I owned the entire condominium. That's right. Every house, every plot, every piece of land there still belonged to my family. I had only allowed it to be turned into a gated community, and, instead of selling the properties outright, I was renting most of them out. So, technically, I wasn't just any resident. I owned the board. And what about her? She had no idea. And that's exactly where I was going to have my fun. After that surreal conversation, I went home trying to decide what would be the best way to put an end to all this nonsense. I could simply tell her right then and there that I owned the entire condominium and watch the last bit of arrogance evaporate from her face. But that would be too easy. I wanted to see how far she would go with this story. Over the next few days, the letters from the HOA kept coming. One was more ridiculous than the other. In addition to the fine for too many cars, I was now also being notified for negative aesthetic impact and improper use of residential space. What did that mean? Absolutely nothing. They were just nice words to say, "We don't like what you do, and we're going to give you hell for it." Even better, they scheduled a special HOA meeting to discuss my violation. Now things were getting good. The meeting would take place in the condominium's community room. I could already imagine the scene. A bunch of nosy neighbors, sitting in uncomfortable chairs, pretending this was some kind of Supreme Court where suburban aesthetic justice would be meted out. And of course, There she would be, feeling like the judge, prosecutor, and executioner of the court, ready to make an example of me. On the night of the meeting, I dressed as if I were going to a casual party, because, for me, that's exactly what it was. Entertainment. I arrived a little early and stood outside watching the other residents arrive. Most were just curious, but some were already whispering among themselves, as if they were about to witness a major scandal. When I entered the hall, there was the woman, sitting at the HOA president's table, with that damn clipboard in front of her. I looked around and noticed some of the HOA board members, the usual extras who only agreed to everything to avoid problems. As soon as I sat down, the meeting began. "Good evening, everyone," she said, with that tone of false authority. "We have called this meeting to deal with an issue that affects the harmony and aesthetics of our condominium." The neighbors murmured. "Ah, yes, of course." The big threat. A guy with too many cars in his garage. She turned to me, holding the clipboard like a judge's gavel. "You have been notified several times about the excess of vehicles on your property, which clearly violates our guidelines." I crossed my arms and feigned interest. "Oh, yes, about that. Where exactly in the regulations does it say that there is a fixed limit of cars per household?" She straightened her glasses and picked up the booklet of rules. "The regulations mention that all properties must maintain a suitable visual standard and avoid aesthetic pollution." "Right," I said, trying not to laugh. "But it still doesn't say how many cars are allowed." She snorted, trying to keep her posture. "It's implied." "Ah, implied. Got it. So the HOA makes up rules at their convenience?" She didn't like the tone. "We're not here to discuss semantics. We're here to enforce the rules and keep the condo organized." And that's when I decided to drop the bombshell. "Well, while we're on the subject of organization, let me ask you a question. Do you know who owns this condominium?" The hall fell silent. I saw some of the neighbors frowning, not understanding what I was getting at. She herself was a little confused by the question, but tried to keep her posture. "The condominium belongs to the residents and the HOA, of course." I smiled. "Wrong. The condominium belongs to me." The silence turned to shock. A few people looked at each other. She blinked a few times, not believing what she was hearing. That doesn't make sense," she said, trying to laugh nervously. "Yes, it does." I took out my cell phone and opened a document. "Here are the property records. I never sold the plots. I only rented them. I am the legal owner of the entire condominium." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. "And while we're on the subject of rules," I continued, crossing my arms, "I think I can say that the most important rule in this place is the owner of the condominium has the final say." The neighbors started whispering. Some seemed genuinely surprised. Others were already laughing at the situation. But she was about to collapse. "That's impossible," she insisted, flipping through papers desperately, as if she was going to find some magic clause that would annul my existence. "It's not impossible. It's just a fact that you didn't bother to check before trying to screw me over." She was red, trembling with rage. "That doesn't change anything. The HOA still has authority." "Does it?" I raised an eyebrow. "Because, as far as I know, the HOA only exists because I let it." And that's when it hit everyone. I wasn't just any resident. I could, if I wanted to, wipe out the entire HOA. Her expression turned from anger to silent fear. Finally, she understood the size of the mess she had made. But I wasn't done yet. "Now, about those ridiculous fines you tried to give me. I think it's my turn to set some rules." And at that moment, I knew that the real fun was just beginning. The silence in the community hall was almost deafening. If someone dropped a pin on the floor at that moment, you could hear the noise echoing. The woman who thought she was the queen of the HOA was sitting there, pale, unable to process the fact that the person she had tried to humiliate was actually the owner of the entire condominium. The rest of the neighbors? Well, they were torn between two types of reactions. Some were clearly enjoying the spectacle, while others seemed concerned, probably because they realized that the great leader of the HOA was nothing more than an ordinary person playing at authority. But I wasn't finished yet. Now that we all know who's really in charge here, let's talk about those ridiculous fines you tried to push on me, I continued, crossing my arms and looking directly at her. The woman opened her mouth to reply, but nothing came out. For the first time, she seemed speechless. Her gaze flickered between indignation and sheer panic. "Look, I'm not a bad person," I continued, feigning a friendly tone. "But I also don't like being bothered for no reason. And frankly, this whole visual pollution thing has gone too far. So, here's what I've decided. All the fines imposed on me are cancelled." She leaned forward, clutching the clipboard as if it were a life jacket in the middle of the ocean. You can't just cancel the HOA's decisions." I smiled. "Actually, I can. Do you want me to explain again? Or have you understood how owning something works?" The neighbors began to laugh quietly, and I could see that some of them were holding back from bursting into laughter. Until that moment, many of them had accepted the HOA's rules without question, simply because they thought there was no alternative. Now, they were seeing that it was all just a facade. "Besides," I continued, ignoring her protests, "I think it's time to review a few things around here. Since I'm the owner, it means I can also make some interesting changes." The woman's eyes widened. "Changes?" I turned to the neighbors, completely ignoring her horrified expression. "Tell me, has anyone here ever had problems with absurd HOA rules?" The hall erupted in murmurs. Many people raised their hands. "Yes, they fined me because my mailbox wasn't the official model," shouted a man from the back. "My daughter wanted to paint her bedroom door blue, and the HOA came to complain that it didn't match the community standard," said a woman, visibly irritated. "They threatened me with a fine because my grass was 2 centimeters higher than it should have been," added another neighbor. "Ah, that was beautiful. It was like watching a riot brewing." "What about the HOA?" Well, the board members were sitting there, visibly uncomfortable. As for the woman in charge, she looked like she was about to explode. "Enough!" she shouted, slamming her hand on the table. "This is ridiculous. We have rules for a reason. Without them, this place is going to turn into chaos." I crossed my arms, looking at her with pure amusement. "Oh, right. Because it's absolute chaos to let someone paint your bedroom door blue, or have a mailbox that doesn't look like a funeral coffin," shouted someone from the back, drawing laughter from the crowd. She huffed, standing up so quickly that her chair almost toppled over. "I won't allow that. I'm the president of the HOA and was." The word came out of my mouth effortlessly, and the effect was instantaneous. Her face froze. "What's it like?" I moved a little closer, looking directly into her eyes. "As the owner of the condominium, I have the right to dissolve the HOA if I want to. And honestly, I think this idea is starting to sound pretty interesting." Silence fell over the hall again. What happened next was a show of desperation. The woman started arguing, issuing veiled threats, trying to convince the other HOA members to side with her. But it was too late. She had lost. The neighbors began to speak louder and louder, recalling years of HOA abuse, senseless rules, idiotic notices, and arbitrary fines. The spell had turned against the sorceress. And then came the final blow. "Here's what I've decided," he said with a smile. "The HOA is no more." The neighbors began to applaud. Some people were shocked. Others looked as if they were about to open bottles of champagne. What about her? She looked like a child who had just lost a favorite toy. You can't do that." "I've already done it." And with that, this woman's era of terror was over. But of course, that didn't mean she was going to accept defeat easily. Cheered on by the neighbors, I felt the weight of victory. But at the same time, I knew that the battle wasn't over yet. The woman from the HOA, although defeated, was far from surrendering. The anger in her eyes didn't lie. She was about to discover that, by messing with me, she had triggered a series of events that she had no way of controlling. "You'll regret this," she shouted, her voice shaking with indignation and fear. Oh, how I loved that kind of reaction. At that moment, it was as if all the power she thought she had was absorbed by me, as if I had been the real target of all her little vendettas. The neighbors were euphoric. Some were already making plans to move house, while others were beginning to discuss the new rules of the condominium, or, rather, the lack of them. I was no longer going to be the target of this woman's attacks. More importantly, I wasn't going to allow any more neighbors to fall victim to her. "Let's talk," I said calmly, moving towards the makeshift stage where she was trying to organize her thoughts. Her mouth was dry, and the HOA board members, who now seemed insignificant and terrified, were staring at me, not knowing what to do. "You can't just do away with the HOA," she muttered, trying to maintain a tone of authority. But there was nothing authoritative about her anymore. The arrogance had evaporated. She was standing, tense, her eyes trying to convey an image of control that was clearly no longer there. "Yes, I can," I replied, as I moved closer. "As I said, I own everything here. That includes your little organization. I can not only dissolve the HOA, I can decide whether it comes back or not. Now, the choice is yours. Either you accept defeat with dignity, or I take a more drastic decision." She seemed to struggle internally. She didn't want to lose control, but the fear was already on her face. What she didn't know was that by challenging someone like me, with so many resources and power, she was digging her own grave. It wasn't a simple battle of rules. It was a war of wills, and she had already lost. "You can't," she tried to speak again, but the words died in her throat as she looked at her neighbors, who were now all standing and applauding. The power she thought she had was gone, and she found herself alone in a sea of mistrust. "Let's wrap this up simply," I said, pointing to the table where the HOA records were still scattered. "I'm going to take full control from now on. There will be no more unfair fines, no more crazy rules to lock people up. What the residents here need is freedom and respect. And as far as I'm concerned, that's what they'll get." Neighbors began to approach, some patting me on the back, others asking for advice on what to do now that the HOA was finally out of the picture. I was satisfied. The pressure had finally been taken off all of us. But what made me feel that the victory had been all the sweeter was seeing the desperation on the HOA woman's face as she tried to cling on to the last vestiges of her non-existent authority. I'll give you a legal answer to that," she said, her voice still shaking, trying to pull herself together. "Do what you want," I replied with a smile, "but you know, deep down, that there's nothing more you can do." And that's how, without further ado, the HOA's power crumbled, without them having time to organize one last reaction. After the meeting, the neighbors began to head for their homes, leaving the community hall empty. I was still there, watching everything with a sense of satisfaction. That night was a real turning point. Not only had I put an end to the tyranny of an HOA that thought it owned the world, but I had also ensured that that place, that condominium, finally became a space of true freedom again. No absurd fines, no rules that made no sense. The woman who ran the HOA, without her power, left without saying another word. I saw her walk out the door with her shoulders slumped, as if all her arrogance had vanished in an instant. And the funniest thing? I knew that she would probably still be thinking about me and what I had done for months. If she had the courage, she could try to get revenge, but with everything I had made clear to her, I knew she would never set foot in that condominium the same way again. The next morning, I and some of my closest neighbors got together to decide on the next steps. The first thing we did was, of course, go to the HOA office and erase any mention of that organization. A new management system was put in place, more transparent, and without the tyranny that once reigned here. Changes began to happen quickly. Now everyone could paint their houses however they wanted, put their mailboxes in whatever shape they liked, and, of course, park their cars without fear of receiving ridiculous notifications. Over time, what was once an oppressive space became a real community. No longer about meaningless rules, but about a place where people could live their lives without the constant fear of being fined or repressed for something small and unimportant. I, for one, was at peace with the decision I had made. It wasn't about the cars. It wasn't about the challenges. It was about not allowing those who think they are above others to continue their petty tyrannies. After all, I not only had the power to own the place, but the power to decide what would be fair for everyone. And so, the HOA's history came to an end, without anyone having to worry about crazy rules, absurd fines, or authorities imposed by those who had no right to govern anything. Fortunately, that was my last lesson, because, in the end, real power doesn't lie in making others bow. It's in knowing when and how to use your voice, and more importantly, when to take the step to change what's wrong. And, as the owner of the condominium, I knew exactly what to do. And if you liked this true story, don't forget to comment and like it.